In a move that surprised many, Russian President Vladimir Putin appointed Andrei Belousov as his new defense minister in 2023. Belousov, an economist with no prior military experience, took the helm of Russia's military apparatus at a critical juncture. Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine had placed immense strain on the country's economy. Putin turned to Belousov to reshape Russia's economic machinery for a protracted conflict. Schooled in the Soviet tradition of central planning, Belousov represented a stark departure from the more liberal, market-oriented economists of the post-Soviet era. His appointment signaled Putin's intention to mobilize Russia's economy for war, echoing Soviet strategies during the Cold War. This shift towards a more centralized, militarized economy immediately raised concerns both domestically and internationally. Andrei Belousov's economic views hark back to the Soviet era. He is a proponent of a strong state role in directing the economy, with a particular emphasis on heavy industry and the military-industrial complex. This approach, often characterized as military Keynesianism, hinges on the belief that government spending in the defense sector can stimulate economic growth. Belousov's appointment signaled a return to the Soviet-style emphasis on central planning. This approach prioritizes state control over key sectors of the economy, with the government dictating production quotas and allocating resources. The goal is to mobilize the country's economic resources to serve the state's strategic objectives, even if it means sacrificing consumer welfare. Belousov's appointment suggested a reversal of the market-oriented reforms pursued after the Soviet Union's collapse, raising questions about Russia's long-term economic development. The idea that military spending can act as an engine of economic growth, often referred to as military Keynesianism, has a long and controversial history. Proponents argue that government investment in the defense sector can create jobs and stimulate technological innovation. They point to historical examples, such as the United States during World War II, where massive military spending coincided with economic expansion. However, critics argue that military Keynesianism is a flawed and unsustainable approach to economic development. Diverting resources to the military sector often comes at the expense of investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Military spending tends to be less efficient than investments in other sectors, focusing on goods and services with limited civilian applications. In Russia's case, reliance on military Keynesianism carries significant risks, given its dependence on energy exports and chronic challenges like corruption and lack of diversification. Pouring resources into the military sector could exacerbate these weaknesses and hinder Russia's long-term economic competitiveness. To understand the potential pitfalls of Russia's current economic trajectory, it is instructive to examine the history of Soviet economic policies. For much of its existence, the Soviet Union adhered to a rigid system of central planning. While the Soviet Union achieved impressive feats of industrialization in its early decades, its centrally planned economy proved unsustainable over the long term. The absence of market mechanisms led to chronic shortages, inefficiency, and a lack of innovation. Despite massive investments in heavy industry and the military, Soviet consumers often lacked access to basic goods and services. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was in a state of stagnation, burdened by a bloated military-industrial complex. The Soviet experience serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations of central planning and the dangers of prioritizing military spending over broader economic development. The Soviet Union's attempts to reform its centrally planned economy ultimately proved insufficient to avert its demise. By the 1980s, under Mikhail Gorbachev, it was clear that the Soviet system was in dire need of change. Gorbachev introduced reforms known as perestroika and glasnost, aimed at restructuring the Soviet economy and introducing greater political openness. However, these reforms proved too little, too late. The Soviet economy was hampered by deep-seated structural problems, including a lack of incentives and pervasive corruption. Attempts to introduce market-oriented reforms were met with resistance and ultimately failed to address the system's fundamental flaws. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era, demonstrating the failures of centrally planned economies and ushering in a period of rapid globalization. After the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia transitioned to a market economy. This shock therapy period saw hyperinflation and economic instability, yet it set the stage for Russia's economic re-emergence. Under Putin, Russia grew economically, driven by rising energy prices. As a major oil and gas exporter, Russia thrived in the early 2000s. This wealth allowed Putin to consolidate power and rebuild the military. However, reliance on energy exports created a vulnerable rentier economy. As Russia's economy grew increasingly reliant on energy exports, Putin began to reverse many of the liberalizing reforms of the 1990s. He consolidated his control over key industries, cracked down on independent media and political opposition, and reasserted the state's role in directing the economy. This shift towards greater state control was driven by Putin's belief that a strong, centralized government was necessary to restore Russia's greatness. However, this turn away from liberalization had negative consequences for Russia's long-term economic prospects. It discouraged foreign investment, stifled innovation, and led to a climate of cronyism and corruption. The Russian economy, despite its energy wealth, remained overly dependent on raw material exports and struggled to develop a more diversified industrial base. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine in 2022 marked a turning point for the Russian economy, triggering a wave of Western sanctions. The war and ensuing sanctions have exacerbated Russia's pre-existing economic weaknesses, exposing the fragility of its economic model. The Western sanctions imposed on Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine have had a profound impact on the country's economy. These sanctions, unprecedented in their scope and severity, have targeted Russia's financial system, energy sector, and key industries. They have frozen Russian assets abroad, restricted access to Western technology, and made it difficult for Russian businesses to operate globally. The sanctions, combined with the economic fallout from the war, have pushed Russia into a deep recession. The ruble has plummeted in value, inflation has soared, and living standards for ordinary Russians have declined. The long-term consequences of the sanctions remain to be seen, but they have undoubtedly set Russia's economy back years. Moreover, the sanctions have accelerated Russia's economic isolation from the West. Russia has been forced to look for alternative economic partners, primarily in Asia, but it is unclear whether these new relationships can fully compensate for the loss of access to Western markets and technology. As Russia grapples with the economic fallout from its war in Ukraine and the weight of Western sanctions, its economic future remains highly uncertain. The country faces declining living standards, capital flight, brain drain, and a shrinking workforce. The appointment of Andrei Belousov as defense minister suggests a Soviet-style approach of prioritizing military spending and state control. However, it is far from clear whether this approach can succeed in the 21st century. Russia's current isolation from the West limits its access to capital, technology, and markets. The legacy of Russia's war in Ukraine and its turn towards a more centralized, militarized economy will likely be felt for generations to come.
So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and let's turn the page on a new adventure together. Get ready to experience books like never before, only on VBook 360. Like, comment, and share to support the channel and keep the video magic alive. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, every video has a story, and every story deserves to be shared. See you in the next video.